Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience in education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Emily Williams. She's a science teacher at Kootenai Classical Academy in Post Falls, Idaho. Previously spent time at Treasure Valley Classical Academy in Fruitland, Idaho. Emily, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit as we begin, before we talk about our subject today, reclaiming science through classical education, maybe about your path to become a science teacher in Idaho.
Great. Yeah. So I started my teaching career in New York City and thought it was pretty great for a while, but then kind of increasingly became somewhat disillusioned with the kind of lack of effectiveness with which I was able to teach students what I thought to be very meaningful. And then listening to a podcast, I heard about Hillsdale schools, and I love the outdoors. So very gratefully made the move to Fruitland, Idaho.
Our topic, reclaiming science through classical education. We have to start with the why, right? Why does science need to be reclaimed? What's wrong?
So I guess the idea for this is the title of a presentation I gave at the conference. And the initial idea for this kind of came about in the year of 2020, where a lot of realizations were made. And during that time, science really kind of came to the forefront of the zeitgeist. It was all of a sudden everywhere. You were reading about science in pretty much any newspaper, YouTube videos. Anytime you turned on the news, there were people there talking about science. And the more that I heard these people talking about science, and the more I heard kind of my friends and even my family talking about science, the more I kind of realized that no one really knows what science is. Mm-hmm. And then I started thinking, at the time I was working in New York City. And so as a science teacher, I started really reflecting on why that might be. And why is it that society has kind of such a misunderstanding of the true nature and purpose of science? And I think in my estimation, we need to bring it back, because understanding the physical world around us and being able to evaluate claims about science, I think is a very important part of being a responsible citizen. And I believe that there's many factors that are contributing to this, but certainly in our schools, we are especially poised to kind of reclaim the true meaning of science.
So what was the original intent and philosophy of science that developed during the scientific revolution?
So when you kind of look at the kind of common characteristics and common ideas that were a part of or that were expressed by these scientists that we, talk about when we're talking about the scientific revolution, so Copernicus and Galileo and Isaac Newton and Johannes Kepler, there's kind of a common, they didn't know it at the time, but really what they were doing was they were kind of creating a philosophy and a model for how modern science should be done. And so some common characteristics and like philosophies, I suppose, that came out of this time was one, they kind of stopped looking to Aristotle's explanations of nature, and they started looking to nature itself. And Nicholas Copernicus has a beautiful quote that I'm probably gonna really mangle right now, but it's something along the lines of the harmony and beauty of the whole world will reveal itself to us if we will only look at the thing with both eyes. And I think that's really beautiful because it shows us that one, that we're capable of understanding nature as humans, and two, that it will reveal itself to us if we fully look at it instead of kind of always having one eye on the current explanation. So that's one thing is we're really starting to base our explanations of nature in observations and experimentation. Another kind of characteristic that came out of this is that science has limitations. And what I learned when I was kind of learning about the scientific revolution, and I think a common narrative about it was that many of these scientists were at odds with the church, and that the scientific revolution was really a kind of push against the establishment and the institution of the church. But really, when you read the writings of the very scientists who were supposedly pushing against it, one, they were all very religious men who had deep faith. And two, they're very clear about the fact that there are limits to what these experiments and observations, and there are limits to what the physical world can tell us. And to quote Galileo, again, probably horribly, he said the Holy Spirit, or the role of the Holy Spirit is to tell us how to get to heaven, not the way the heavens go. So if we're looking for moral guidance, we will look to the scriptures. If we're looking to understand the natural world, we will look to nature itself. So that kind of limitation to science was, again, something else that came out of the scientific revolution.
Observation and experimentation seems to point us to an endpoint in which everything is clear because we either see it or it's proven through this experimentation. So did we slide away from that at some point?
I think that the general kind of process of experimentation has been preserved. I think the real problem when it comes to science, and why I think that we're kind of in a place of a problematic place as a society, is the way that those results are communicated, one. Two, the way that students are taught about the process of science, and the level to which students are kind of helped and supported in engaging in the larger scientific discussion that's happening around them. I think that something that came out a lot just kind of like on this is, something that came out of the whole past 4 years was we started seeing a lot of headlines, kind of saying things like, you just have to trust the experts, or you just believe the science, just follow it. And these are all very passive, very unscientific ways to engage with science. And if we look back again to the original intent of science, it was, Copernicus and Galileo. These were people who did not just follow the consensus. These were people who made observations and were so compelled by what they saw that they felt obligated to share their findings with the world, even though it contradicted the dogma of the time. And so I think that's kind of just one example of how far we've strayed. And something else I just will say now about kind of the original intent of science was that it was for everyone, that everyone could engage in the scientific process. And Einstein has a quote that the scientific method is just a refinement of human thinking. This is just kind of refining the ways that we draw conclusions about the physical world, and that this is something that everyone can think about, and that we don't have to just blindly trust experts. In fact, I'm just going to throw another quote in here. The great physicist Richard Feynman defined science as a belief in the ignorance of experts. So for science to progress, we have to believe that these experts can be ignorant. And I think that this idea is something that has largely been lost.
I'll try to ask this carefully. Over the past 4 years, we have seen some people who would say they've lost trust in science.
Yes.
Right? They've lost that trust. So what are the consequences of that loss of trust, not just in one particular experiment, let's say, but in the idea of science as a whole?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of reasons that people could say that, but certainly I think something that I try to equip my students to do is to be able to understand kind of how science is presented to us, and it's been tainted often by a lot of different forces. So just as an example of that, we have, when we look at just medical research and when we look at food research, these are being funded primarily by the government and by pharmaceutical or by food companies. And so this is not to say that government funding and company funding, private funding, can't yield good results, but there is often a kind of interest that is behind the scenes. And just, because I haven't said enough quotes, there's an author whose name is Alston Chase, who says when science becomes, entwined with political advocacy, the quest for truth becomes a quest for power. And I think that's a really good summary of what has happened, is that often these things that are labeled as science, it really isn't representing science. It's using, I think, kind of nefariously the trust and respect that people have for scientific discoveries to kind of push an agenda that might not necessarily be based in scientific research. And this is why I think it's so important to help our students understand the content of science and have confidence in their ability to engage in it, so that they don't have to trust science or not trust science, so that they can, if they have a question about something, well, one, I want them to question everything they're hearing everyone say about science. And I want them to have confidence in themselves that they're going to be able to go to that study and read it and make their own decision. So I think that it's largely, I think when we think about science as, a good or a bad thing, we're really missing what it should be and how we should really think about it.
Talking with Emily Williams about reclaiming science through classical education. So why is that an answer? How can a classical education help to reclaim science for our students?
Yeah, so I tell this story a lot, but when I was teaching in New York City public schools, I was it almost felt like my soul was sucked out of me, but I didn't really know why. And then I was sent the curriculum essay in our program guides for science, and which lays out our entire philosophy about teaching science. And I was sitting on a park bench in New York City reading it, and I almost wanted to cry. I was so this is it. This is why I have felt so this sense of just meaninglessness, because we are not after anything truly meaningful. And so much of kind of what I just said, that it has gone wrong with science. And, I think this corruption of this beautiful discipline and really important part of our humanity is explicitly addressed in our approach to science education. So just as an example, we are expected as teachers in Hillsdale schools to discuss the historical context of what we talk about. And in doing so, we are not only helping to educate our students on just kind of, the facts about who discovered what, but we're really giving them examples of the true nature of science and how it works, and how these people who have really helped to progress our understanding of the natural world were very often the ones who are standing up and saying, I don't think what we all think is right. And I think it's really important for students to see examples of that and to know the important role that plays in science. I think additionally, the fact that our approach to science is so explicitly content-based. Mm-hmm. We do not gloss over the details, nor do we think, I don't know if the students can handle this. That might be too much. No, we're getting into, I want to make sure that you understand how to think about the scientific concepts that you will come across in your life. And will we hit everything they'll hear about? No, but we will get them to a place where they can ask the right questions to get to where they need to be about anything they hear in science. And I think that these two things, just a kind of basic understanding of the nature and philosophy of science and that history of it, the limitations of it. I think that's another beautiful thing about our curriculum is it explicitly says there's limits to what we can figure out. And this is why you take science and math, is to figure out kind of these physical world parts of our existence. But, there's this whole other world that is a part of being a human that you're going to explore in your history and in your literature class and in your philosophy classes. And I think that is so beautiful. And I think very important for students to understand, because something that I hear a lot also that I didn't mention earlier was this idea of scientism, and this idea that a lot of people in society have that, well, if we can't answer it by doing an experiment, then it doesn't exist. And I think that does a disservice to the human experience when we just reduce it to the physical world.
You've been teaching science long enough. I was going to say a long time.
That's okay.
Take that the wrong way. Have you noticed that your students' attitudes, approach toward science have changed over the years?
Yes, I have. And so when I first started teaching science, I was teaching, and the standards in my school district were pretty content-based. And there was never a question. Students really didn't ask, actually, when I first started teaching, why as much? Because as a science teacher, I was expected to teach the content. Mm-hmm. But as the standards changed and as we got farther away, first we had the incorporation of the Common Core standards, and now we have the national science standards. Those standards are much more skill-based. So we are expected to assess students not so much on their science content knowledge or what they can do with that science content knowledge, mm-hmm. but more in their kind of ability to do scientific skills. And I think, I never thought about this question. I like it. But in hindsight, that's kind of when I started hearing those questions. Why do I have to do this? What is it? The farther away I moved from the content mm-hmm. was kind of where I saw just a lack of that natural engagement. Because as I was saying earlier, science is worthy of knowing for its own sake. And if you can find ways as teachers, I think very easily as a science teacher, to pull that wonder out of them. But if I'm just assessing you on how you can, follow a procedure, well, that's not as beautiful. And so I think that was a big challenge that I ran into was kind of as that expectation decreased, so did the kind of engagement of the students. And I think that happens a lot of the time when you're working under a place with low expectations, you kind of will take those on. And but then since coming to the Classical Academy, again, it's so content-based. I'm kind of back where I started, I feel, in many ways. And it's just a lot more joyful every day.
Emily Williams is a science teacher at Kootenai Classical Academy in Post Falls, Idaho, previously at Treasure Valley Classical Academy in Fruitland, Idaho, as we talk about reclaiming science through classical education. Emily, thanks so much for joining us here on the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K12. That's Hillsdale_K12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio.